In looking at modern art in Europe and America, we will see the way that art changes throughout the 20th century. The center of the art world moves from Paris to New York, and the abstract expressionists take center stage in the 20th century. But there are more than just these white male artists in New York making work in the United States. This is a diverse country, and its artistic production is also diverse. Between World War I and World War II, the Harlem Renaissance became an important cultural force. African Americans moved north from the South and began to seek more political equality. Alain Locke was an intellectual leader of the Harlem Renaissance. He had a BA and PhD from Harvard and was the first African American Rhodes Scholar. Locke promoted African American artists. Unlike his friend W.E.B. Du Bois, Locke argued that the African American artists were first of all responsible to themselves and their own individual visions, rather than to society and the uplifting of the race. So he allowed them to pursue their own visions and not be obligated. Aaron Douglas, in this painting, calls African Americans to exercise their new freedom and right to vote in the face of new and continuing challenges. So in this painting, you have the Klan, and you have field labor, cotton, in the foreground. And then you see an individual exercising his right to vote and a forward movement depicted. Augusta Savage was originally turned down from studying in Europe because of her race. She says, quote, "Democracy is a strange thing. My brother was good enough to be accepted in one of the regiments that saw service in France during the war, but it seems that his sister is not good enough to be a guest of the country for which he fought," unquote. She did eventually go to Paris, and this sculpture represents freedom and hope. La Citadelle, in the title, is a reference to the first black leaders of Haiti. Savage had an art school in Harlem and even received funds through the Works Progress Administration, which helped fund artists. Jacob Lawrence was one of her students, or he studied there. His paintings depicted African Americans in the Great Migration. Lawrence became the best known artist to come out of the Harlem Community Art Center. And this here is an image of a train station in which Southerners come north for new opportunities, as well as new difficulties. So his pictures depicted all the steps along the way of the Great Migration. They are flattened in terms of color. There's not a lot of depth of field, not a lot of depth, and not a lot of volume. His colors and forms are inspired by abstraction and brightly colored patterns. He depicts real situations and includes metaphorical details. For example, many of his paintings include ladders, a possible metaphor for spiritual renewal or the movement to a higher reality. Dorothea Lange was paid by the U.S. government to photograph migrant workers to encourage public support for assistance for them. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, Nipomo, California, from 1936, shows a poor woman and her ragged children. She has a concerned look on her brow. And in order to create as much emotion as possible, Lange crops her image intentionally to emphasize the emotions of the mother. Here you see some of the different photographs that she took. Documentary photographers might appear to be merely recording reality, but they make lots of decisions to capture specific instances. And, by taking many pictures, then she can choose the picture that will best convey the message that she wants to communicate. So she cropped the one picture that finally said what she was trying to say. American Gothic reveals the changing landscape of rural America. It's strong, but also anxious. There are fewer men, fewer husbands, for example, for this young woman. In Canada, the group of 7 painted the cold light of the Canadian landscape. As a Minnesotan, I can really feel and kind of resonate with this cold light. They were united. This is from the group of 7. They were united in venturing out into the Canadian wilderness to capture light and color on canvas. Emily Carr is another Canadian artist who painted the Canadian landscape. She decided to put painting on the back burner when she opened a boarding house. She found that she couldn't make a living at painting. But eventually, when she met the group of 7, they inspired her to start painting again. She admired them, but she also knew that they would never accept a woman into their movement. She painted the Native American subjects to make this vanishing aspect of Canadian culture new again. In Mexico, Diego Rivera made murals inspired both by Renaissance frescoes and Mexican indigenous art. He's fusing these two different cultures. He wanted to create a truly revolutionary art, an art that had a political meaning and a purpose for the service of the people. He was married to Frida Kahlo, who painted images of her own suffering. Her relationship with Rivera was stormy, as these paintings show. She says that he only loved the Mexican part of her, not the European part. The artery between the two Fridas starts at an image of Diego as a boy, and then the heart reminds us of the Aztec practice of removing hearts, while the blood also references the pain she experienced from a broken pelvis after a car accident, and thus a lifetime of subsequent pain. Moving even further south to Brazil, poet Oswald de Andrade encouraged an ironic turning on its head of the European assumptions and stereotypes about Latin America. So, if Europeans thought of them as savages, then they should do what the natives did to the first Portuguese who arrived on their shores. They should eat them. This is meant as a metaphor for taking European styles, kind of digesting them, taking those ideas and digesting them in new ways to create distinctly Latin American art. In Europe, Picasso also began to use his paintbrush as a weapon against fascism. So as we have seen up to this point, Picasso sought freedom in new modes of making art, in new modes of painting. His art, however, was not political. He was not seeking a political freedom. In the real world, he was interested in artistic freedom and challenging old conventions of making pictures, pictorial conventions. He has not dealt, however, with political realities outside the doors of the studio, but all of that changes with Guernica. We can only understand Guernica if we know the context, what he was trying to do. In 1936 to 1939, Spain was involved in a civil war. The left-wing Republicans were against the right-wing Nationalist Party that was led by General Franco. And the Nationalist Party was a fascist party. It was supported by the Nazis, as well as the Italian fascists. In 1939, the German Nazis bombed the Basque town of Guernica because it refused to surrender. And the bombing was merely a practice raid, but 70% of the town was destroyed. Picasso finally felt the need to respond to this atrocity in paint, depicting the cries of human and animal suffering devastated by the bombing. Another artist who deals with the violence of war is Francis Bacon. The horrors of World War II left Europe broken. 30 million people died, which included those killed in bomb raids, soldiers fighting, and of course the Jews and others who were killed in concentration camps. Bacon aimed to remake the violence of reality itself in paint, conveying all of the horror that a post-World War II Europe felt about its past and its future. Art informel was a reaction to Cubism. That's what we're seeing here. Cubism was very disciplined, had geometric abstraction. This was the opposite. These artists preferred a more intuitive and spontaneous approach to painting, refusing sort of that regimented style. So the work I'm showing here by Francis Bacon and Picasso, this work all comes from Europe. But after World War II, there was a new center of art, and Paris was not it. If you remember, Paris held sway since at least the 19th century. Paris set the standards. It was the place to be. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, people were beginning to question whether art should be a mere imitation of things in the visible and natural world. So since the Renaissance, the goal of painting had been to make a window into reality. Think of The Last Supper with that one-point perspective converging on Jesus' head. That's sort of a window into a space, a deep space. But artists began to wonder if painting could be more than a window. Instead of slavishly imitating the things they saw, artists wanted their art to create new things that had never existed before in the natural world. After all, photography made it possible to get the same results of that idea of a window with the click of a button, rather than the hours it takes to make a painting. So artists were asking, what is the purpose of art if it's no longer needed to imitate the visual world as accurately as possible? And we saw some of those responses with Impressionism and then Expressionism. And those developments began in Paris. But World War II caused many of the most important artists and intellectuals to flee to New York, which became a new artistic center. Out of this community, the most important art movement of the 1950s in the world was born, Abstract Expressionism. So we'll look at a number of artists who can be considered Abstract Expressionism. For example, Barnett Newman, this painting pictured here from 1950 to 51. There was a critic who championed the Abstract Expressionist. His name was Clement Greenberg, and he argued that painting should be about its fundamental characteristics. What does that mean? Well, rather than painting being about an illusion of pictorial space, rather than it being about something that you're depicting, like Jesus on a cross or the Virgin Mary, for example, paintings should remind us that a painting is, at its most basic level, distinct from all other things. And how is it distinct? It has certain characteristics. A painting has characteristics such as flatness. A painting is flat. And surface. The paint is on the surface. But the artists that we'll see are interested in more than just flatness and the application of color to canvas, despite what Clement Greenberg might have said. But you can see already, if you look at this painting, where that idea how that idea relates to this work. There's a sense of flatness. This is about color on the canvas. But for Newman, it's also about much more. So we have an artist like Arshile Gorky, who created surreal, mythical landscapes, these images of an idyllic childhood that relate to ideas about the collective unconscious. So this is abstraction, but it's not just about the surface or about the characteristics of a painting that make it different than, say, a sculpture. So he's interested in the subconscious. Abstraction lends itself to the expression of a collective unconscious because its forms are more universal than particular. We don't recognize particular things here, but we can all relate to these forms in some way or another. His own personal memories of his father's garden are the inspiration for this image. Jackson Pollock, on the other hand, made action paintings. This means that his action creates the painting, and the painting itself is a record of that event. So he's hurling paint, flinging paint across the canvas. It's laid out on the floor. It's like a dance or a performance, and the final result is a record of that performance. The final way that the paint falls is a result of the way he moves with the buckets of paint across the canvas on the floor. But he is in control of the gesture, as you might not be able to tell, but he really has a lot of control over what he makes here. Pollock takes the expression of the line to a new level. So rather than drawing a line that expresses an emotion, a line can be very expressive, he allows the line to be a direct result of his expression, a direct imprint of the expression of his movement. This is art as performance. We're on the step towards performance art. And the painting is a record of a particular action. So here, painting becomes more of a performance than a rendering of something else outside of the painting. It's a record of a performance rather than a depiction of an illusion. De Kooning's way of working typifies that of many abstract expressionists. He's different than Pollock. But he reported painting this particular painting around 200 times, according to his wife, Elaine. So that's another aspect of abstract expressionism. Many of them would sacrifice everything that they had done up to that point in order to redo the composition if they felt that the composition required it. This aggressive image reintroduces the figure, and for de Kooning, he had a lot of sort of vulgar, rather sexist and vicious images. A couple of other abstract expressionists are Joan Mitchell, who uses color powerfully, like in this picture called Ladybug, and Helen Frankenthaler, who pours paint on her canvases in her own unique variation of Pollock's method. One of the most famous abstract expressionists was Mark Rothko, And since Rothko was all about color, he rejected the conventions of linear perspective. So we've already talked about that idea that, when you look at the Last Supper, linear perspective gives you a sense of a window into a world. But why would Rothko in particular want to reject linear perspective? Well, it's because of his love of color. Now, why would he feel the need to reject linear perspective just because he loves color? Well, when you think about it, think about atmospheric perspective. As you look farther into the distance, color begins to dim. It looks a little bit grayer, a little bluer, a little hazier because of that effect of particles in the atmosphere. If you want really saturated color, the colors need to be right on the surface of things. Even if you're creating a volume, you need shadows and highlights, and so the color is not just pure saturated hue, which is what Rothko works with. So he's not interested in an illusion of space. He wants the surface and the direct color to be the experience for the viewer. The experience is the purpose of the painting. So standing before Rothko, you want to experience that color. But his subject matter is not just color. Not just color for color's sake, at least. He believes that his color fields can express timeless and universal realities. So if you stand in front of a painting like this, it's big enough to sort of be immersed in the painting. You don't get the sense from a small image, so I recommend seeing some of his work at a museum. And you experience something timeless. It goes beyond symbolic imagery to touch our deepest and most primitive psychological experiences, at least according to Rothko. So illusionistic references divert the viewer from the epic experience of life and death that his paintings aimed at. He doesn't want any distractions based in particular experience. He wants a direct encounter with the viewer with no other mediating content. References to specific things are obstacles between the viewer and the painter, and so he wants to take down those obstacles and create that direct experience. The largeness of these paintings facilitate that direct experience. They envelop the viewer. Barnett Newman, as we saw in the beginning, aims to penetrate into metaphysical secrets. So you might ask how. He asks viewers to view the painting up close, to be bathed in its color, and something happens to us physically when we experience a painting like this with our eyes. We take in the color with our eyes, but we feel something in our whole bodies. In a culture that's lost its grounding in stories and traditions, he aims to create a new encounter with the sublime that doesn't really require a story or a tradition for the encounter. His paintings deal with the sublime. As I mentioned, it's a category of experience that is distinct from the category of beauty. So a human has an encounter with the sublime when faced with chaos, terror, and the formlessness of nature. Human beings are small in comparison to nature, just as we are small in comparison to viewing Barnett Newman's painting. Your book argues that the red is the vast expanse of the sublime, quote, interrupted only by the dangerous zips of other colors that threaten, like a tragic human flaw, to unbalance it, unquote. It is as if the zip is the interruption in the power of the sublime red. The human failing is inevitable, but still tragic. Thus, abstract expressionism is known for expanding into new territory that pushed the boundaries of art and rejected what came before in many cases. They reflected the sense of alienation and social crisis of post-war 1950s, and they hoped to depict universal experiences and experiences of the sublime that would go beyond the shallow, cookie-cutter American consumer experience. That was what they were aiming at, going beyond sort of consumerism. However, their work is not political in the sense of engaging directly with political issues of the time. You can sort of see the difference if you compare Newman with Picasso, right here in this case. We will also see in the later part of the 20th century a swing back of the pendulum, back to a more politically engaged art. But you'll have to view the next lecture to see how artists decide to bring art back into life.